So for today, we have kind of a combination class, if you will. Our photography and film class are actually covering some similar topics that range between photography and film. I will be covering ISO, whereas Gwyneth will be covering dynamic range. So, rolling into ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization, and these folks deal primarily with the measurement of light sensitivity. As we discussed previously in an earlier episode, ISO deals primarily with the measurement of light sensitivity in film stock. So those rolls of film that you would put into cameras, whether they be photography cameras or film cameras. More accurately, ISO refers to the size of the light-sensitive particles in that film stock. Each of those light-sensitive particles will capture a small amount of the light projected through the lens and take on the hue, color, and brightness of that light. These light-sensitive particles are very much like pixels in digital cameras. So ISO 100 film stock has very small light-sensitive particles and performs best in bright light situations, such as daylight. Higher ISO film stock, such as ISO 800, has much larger light-sensitive particles. Because the particles are larger, they have much greater surface area with which to catch the light. The downside of higher ISO film is those particles are larger, so the picture's not as clear and there's more grain. When referring to a digital camera, ISO is not a measurement of sensor sensitivity. Your sensor has a set sensitivity, or base or native ISO. ISO is just a measurement of the gain or amplification applied to the sensor. It's kind of like a concert. The singer's voice has one volume, but through amplification, microphones, amplifiers, larger speakers, etc., that one volume voice is able to fill an entire stadium. Unlike film stock, on a digital camera, when you increase your ISO, you don't get grain, you get noise. Digital noise is feedback, and it's always one pixel in size and can be multicolored. So, ISO doubles every step up. So it jumps from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800, and etc. Now, each of those steps in ISO, so moving from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, is the equivalent of one stop, kind of like f-stops. So jumping from ISO 100 to ISO 400 is two steps, and therefore two stops brighter. We will cover stops in more depth in a later episode, but for the purposes of this class, all you need to know is a stop is a measurement of exposure that either halves or doubles the amount of light that affects the final image. Now, as we discussed earlier, ISO is a measurement of how much gain is applied to what the sensor detects. Now, this part is a little confusing, so bear with us. Some cameras have ISO and gain settings, and they're measured as two separate metrics. So we'll explain that here right now. While ISO is measured in larger, even numbers, so 100, 200, 400, 800, etc., when gain is available as its own metric, it's measured in decibels. Gain, or the decibels in gain, are similar to ISO in that they double with each step. So 0, 9 decibels, 18 decibels, etc. And same as with ISO, each step is a measurement of exposure that either halves or doubles the amount of light that affects the final image. Ultimately, these two separate metrics are measurements of the same exact thing. Simply put, if you increase your ISO by 2 stops, and you increase your gain, again measured in decibels, by 2 stops, you've effectively increased the sensor's amplification by 4 stops. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. Again, measuring the same thing. Base or native ISO is a reflection of your sensor's true sensitivity. Any ISO measurement above your native or base ISO is simply an amplification of what your sensor already detects. Any setting below the base or native ISO is simply a de-amplification of what that sensor already detects. Native ISO is the point at which the signal-to-noise ratio is at its best. Most cameras' native ISOs are generally under ISO 400. However, with our Sony a7S II, the native ISO is 1600. This is because, as mentioned before in our first episode, the Sony a7S II is geared for hypersensitivity, allowing it to perform very well in low light conditions. So again, base or native ISO is generally the ISO setting in which your image will look its best, environmental aspects aside. As such, when your camera is set to its base or native ISO, its dynamic range is at its widest or at its best.